In SourceCast episode 97, I dedicated the entire podcast to talking about Amazon's workplace culture, what it's like for the temporary workers during the holidays, and what it's like for the people working in the offices. I don't want to be accused of singling out a specific company, so this week I read an article about Google acquiring a Microsoft employee, and that Microsoft employee, Tim Sneth, I'm not going to say he talked trash. Even though the headline says he talked trash, he didn't talk trash. He made a couple of criticisms about Microsoft on the way out. So that made me start to think about Google's workplace culture, because a lot of Microsoft people have been leaving and going over to Google. And thanks to recently reading Satya Nadella's book, Hit Refresh, wow, I just gave him a free plug. That book very gently sort of addresses the toxic workplace culture that was Microsoft before Satya took over. So if those people are leaving and heading over to Google, what's happening to Google? So this week we are talking about Google's workplace culture, specifically as a result of the Microsoft defections. I'm Joey Lombardi, and this is SourceCast episode 98. There is no acquisition news of note to speak of, but before we get to our main topic, I do want to set your expectations for SourceCast episode 100. That's coming up in a few weeks, people, and I'm hoping to have a few special guests, so be on the lookout for that one. On to our main topic. Google has been bringing in a lot of Microsoft employees, which on paper doesn't seem like that big of a deal. All of the companies are poaching from each other. But when I read Satya Nadella's book, and he basically stated that one of the major things that he had to do when he took the company over was fix the toxic culture within the divisions. And he does not use the term toxic culture. He is very gentle with his wording, but there have been reports of infighting between Microsoft's divisions for years. Satya does talk about it to some degree, but he paints the picture more of a resource constraint issue. One division wouldn't provide support to an upcoming project because they didn't think it was worth the resources, so that project was doomed to fail. A lot of the early cloud initiatives that Satya was involved in required him having to advocate and fight for resources and some organizational changes to get those projects up and running. So this recent defection from a Microsoft employee to Google, Tim Sneth, his comments on the way out are very consistent with Satya Nadella's comments in the book, but they're a little less polished. According to a WindowsLatest.com article, Sneth is leaving Microsoft to work on Google's new Flutter mobile network. He was with Microsoft for 17 years prior. He did compliment Microsoft and said it was an amazing company to work for, but he did say that the company made a lot of mistakes, especially during the Vista era. And I quote, "Microsoft failed to adjust rapidly to the new competitive threats posed by the rise of standard-based web and the resurgence of Apple and the iPhone. Its rapid growth left it with defender's dilemma of being attacked by all sides, while also being unwilling to sacrifice existing businesses for new opportunities." As a side point, in his book, that's exactly what Satya Nadella did. Windows Server Division, Windows 10 from a profit perspective, they were all sacrificed to get consumers on a unified platform and to get them interested in cloud. Tim also talked about Microsoft's infighting, and here's a quote, "Infighting between different divisions left client developers in the Microsoft ecosystem caught in the crossfire, with little clarity for those who wanted to bet on something that would endure." So this is the picture of Microsoft from a couple of years ago. This is before Satya took over, and this is also during a time where Google started to recruit a lot of Microsoft employees. In Satya's book, he doesn't expressly state that they forced people out, but he does mention several times that quote-unquote good people left. So if you were a Ballmer-era Microsoft employee that had a well-established fiefdom and everything's plugging along, and then Satya Nadella comes along and starts talking about teamwork, and they're going to focus on the cloud and sacrifice some of their server business, and we're going to make sure all the divisions are talking to each other, and you're someone who's been entrenched and just plugging along doing your thing and have a profit center because you're working directly with certain clients and customers on the outside, you can imagine how that's going to go over. So those people are picking up their stakes, wrapping up the tent, and moving along to Google. You may not think of Google as that cutthroat. I certainly envision it more of a hippie culture or a hipster culture where everyone's sitting around in couches and getting their laundry done and bringing their dogs to work, and they have all their fancy HR algorithms to make sure everybody's happy. But they're suddenly bringing in these fiefdom builders from Microsoft. What does that picture look like? In January 2017, Forbes posted an article written by Andrew Cave with the headline, "If you want to get poached by Google, join Microsoft." So they researched on LinkedIn and started to develop migration paths from Microsoft to Google. 12,798 of the Internet Group employees at Google came from other major tech firms, and nearly one-third of those people, 4,151, previously worked in Microsoft. As a side point, Microsoft poached back 896 Google employees. So there's clearly a lot of migration going to Google. There was clearly people who were comfortable in the Ballmer and Gates regimes that were uncomfortable with Satya Nadella's ascendance. Or, if you've been with a company for a long time, you just feel like it's time for a change. Let's not underscore that. But if you have thousands of employees who formerly worked from one company and moving over to another, there has to be a cultural paradigm shift. I am certainly not the first one to point out that Google is becoming similar to Microsoft, especially in its previous years. There's a Tech Radar article that lists 10 good reasons. We'll go through a few of them. We've certainly discussed that Google has been accused of being a monopoly recently. Microsoft XP was at one point used by 80% of all computer users, and Internet Explorer had a 97% market share. And that's when the government started getting involved. And they got Microsoft on pushing its own products, which is exactly what they're trying to do to Google on web searches. Google has nearly 70% of the market share for search, and it's in the 90s in Europe. And obviously the European Union is not pleased with that, and they just recently gave them a multi-billion-dollar fine, which I still think is shady, because that money is going right into the European Union Commission's pockets and not going back to any of the companies that were impacted by these business practices. When it comes to the mobile market, Google is the Microsoft of smartphones. Where Apple is always Apple and they have a contained ecosystem of software and hardware, Google, they have a lot of developers, they have a lot more applications coming from third parties, and they have more malware. Everybody always says you can't get a virus on an Apple machine, which is untrue, by the way, but they're less likely. Keeping a clean ecosystem of applications is much more difficult when you're working with multiple manufacturers. There's only one kind of iPhone. There are multiple manufacturers for Android-based smartphones. So between patches and updates and all the different hardware, it's much more difficult to have a clean ecosystem without malware. Another former knock on Microsoft that Google is now being accused of is trying to be everything to everyone. There was a time where Microsoft was trying to compete with multiple different technology companies, competing with the iPhone, with their Zune product, and obviously with their smartphones, which have recently been canceled, although they have been successful with the gaming platforms. But Microsoft makes PCs, they make keyboards, they make mouses. There's a lot of product they were trying to produce and be competitive with to varying degrees of success. Now Google, who is the advertising and search leader, they're trying to branch out into other revenue streams. That was evident when it was announced that Google would fall under a parent company called Alphabet, and Google started to branch out into smart speakers, smart thermostats when they acquired Nest. They're investing in robotics, although they recently sold some of that off. They keep purchasing mobile companies and then selling off assets, like with Motorola. And of course, they're investing in smart, self-driving cars. Some critics are accusing the company of being distracted and not focusing on the core aspects that make the company money. That could be a valid argument, or the decisions to divest will prove to be the thing that keeps the company functioning and give it longevity. There was another article by Forbes by author Gordon Kelly that also talks about Google's de-emphasis on mobile. In the article, Kelly points out that Google's AdSense revenue is declining, and that Google's market share in advertising is at its lowest point in 7 years. And on top of that, or maybe because of that, Google is now deprioritizing mobile. And I quote, "So where's Google attention now? Apparently moonshot projects. The company shouts excitedly about self-driving cars, internet delivery hot air balloons, revolutionary contact lenses, virtual reality cardboard headsets, glasses, modular phones, and the painfully slow lottery-style rollout of its Google Fiber gigabit broadband initiative, which they have also backed off of since this article was written." Of the variety of projects that Gordon Kelly called out, those virtual reality cardboard headsets, that's something that both Microsoft and Google are investing heavily in right now. Google's trying to do it cheaply and make it affordable for consumers to adopt. Microsoft is going the other way and really investing in some advanced technologies. Not to keep mentioning Satya Nadella's book, but he spends a lot of time talking about augmented reality technologies and how it is a pillar for Microsoft in the future. It's very interesting to compare and contrast how each company is addressing that and how they both view that technology as critical for the company's futures. So what is the net effect of all of these Microsoft employees moving to Google? It's hard to say, but I think it's clear that there's a shift in focus away from Google's core web and advertising priorities to branching out into other revenue streams. If you look at Yahoo as an example, I would say it's probably smart to divest and to have other revenue streams and other business opportunities because search can dry up. The industry landscape can change with some other technology, but I suppose you can't keep allowing the thing that actually makes the company money to erode. This isn't going to be one of those endings where I talk about the future of Google. It's very hard to determine where that company's going to go, but they have a lot of money, they have a lot of market share, and they're not disappearing anytime soon. Throughout the article, I also mentioned that certain projects that Google has been funding for years, and were mentioned in some of these articles, were defunded or canceled. And I suspect that's also part of the Microsoft effect. That ruthlessness, that cutthroat approach that Satya Nadella addressed in his book, I think a little bit of that did leak over to Google, and that's why you're seeing some of these projects start to get canceled. I think it's admirable that they're trying to invest in different technologies and see what grows, but at a certain point you have to cut it off if it's not delivering what you need it to deliver. There's one thing that Microsoft and Google can both hang their hats on. It doesn't seem like either company has the toxic culture that was described in last week's podcast with Amazon. Sometimes you take the victories where you can get them.
And that's all we have for this week. You can find SourceCast on iTunes, Google Music, and all of your favorite podcasting applications. SourceCast is recorded in Bucolic, Mantua, New Jersey, and it's produced by my dad. The outro is performed by me, Ben Lombardi, and music is provided by Patrick Lee. Thanks for listening, and we'll be back next week.